Now let's take a quick look at the cerebral cortex. Remember, the cerebrum is made up of left and right hemispheres and comprises of the predominant mass of the brain, what you look at when you go into a cadaver lab. But remember that there's an outer shell to the cerebrum called the cerebral cortex. Now this outer shell is only a couple of millimeters thick, but can be broken up into a number of different lobes. And there's actually four major lobes. There's a frontal lobe, a temporal lobe, a parietal lobe, and an occipital lobe. And we're going to take a quick look now at the frontal lobe. But first, let's talk about some of the topographical characteristics of the brain. So when we take the brain, you know that when you first look at it, you see all these bumps and lumps and grooves and dips and so forth. When you see a bump up on the brain, that's called a gyrus. If there's multiple, so plural, it's called gyri. And the dip down is called a sulcus, and again, plural, it's sulci. Now what I've drawn on this particular brain, so you can see we've got the anterior aspect of the brain, posterior aspect of the brain. Here's the cerebellum, and you can see part of the brain stem and then beginning of the spinal cord. And you can see that I've drawn a couple of these lumps and bumps, but not throughout the whole brain because it would have taken too long and it would make it look a little bit too messy. So when you've got a groove down, sulcus, bump up, gyrus. So a couple of important parts. First is that you can see that there is a major sulcus right here, so a major groove, and this is called the lateral sulcus, also known as the Sylvanian fissure. You've also got a major sulcus right down the middle as well, and that's called the central sulcus. These are very important. They're important because they separate some important functions of the brain, but also important in separating out the lobes as well. Today we're looking at the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe, you can see its boundaries posteriorly are the central sulcus here, so that's the posterior aspect of the frontal lobe, and inferiorly the boundary is this lateral sulcus, which means this part of the cerebral cortex is known as the frontal lobe. Let's write that up. Now let's talk about some important parts of the frontal lobe. Well, apart from saying that this is the central sulcus, something very important is that if you have a little groove down, well, what's going to be immediately anterior to that groove? A bump up. So what we find here is that immediately anterior to this central sulcus is a bump up, a gyrus, and this is called the Precentral Gyrus. So let's actually write some of these down. So this is the central sulcus. And then immediately anterior to that central sulcus is the Precentral Gyrus. Precentral Gyrus. Why is the precentral gyrus important? Well, it's important because it's part of the frontal lobe, but it's also important because it's what we call the primary motor cortex. This strip, this gyrus that travels down the most anterior aspect of the frontal lobe is the primary motor cortex. Let's write that down. So the precentral gyrus, primary motor cortex. Primary motor cortex. What does this mean? Well, primary motor cortex, this is where we initiate voluntary movement. So that means we're initiating movement of our skeletal muscles. So that's going to be hands, feet, legs, stomach, face, tongue. Think about all the parts of the body that you can consciously move. This is going to be controlled by skeletal muscle, and it begins here at the primary motor cortex. Now what you're going to find is that anterior to the primary motor cortex, there's other areas for motor movement which are known as premotor cortex and association cortex. So immediately anterior to the primary motor cortex is the premotor cortex and other association cortices. So areas that play a role. So what does the premotor cortex do, for example? Well, the premotor cortex plays a role in planned, routine motor movement. Think about if you're going to play the piano and you've played it before, premotor cortex is coming into play. If you're juggling and you've juggled before, premotor cortex is coming into play. Now, this is where we initiate this voluntary movement, but it needs to get to the muscle itself, which means it needs to move through certain fibers, and it needs to descend into deeper parts of the brain. It descends through to deeper parts of the brain and then subsequently down to the spinal cord and out through the peripheral nerves via certain white matter tracts called pyramidal tracts. So this descension of this motor signal goes down pyramidal tracts, and this has to do with motor movement. Now, let's just say we do a frontal plane. We make a frontal section and we create a frontal plane. Now we look into the brain from that angle. We're going to see, so it's going to look like this. This is just one hemisphere, okay? So we're looking into the brain from a frontal view. This is one area. What's very important is this. We want to, the primary motor cortex has been stimulated to move my arm, for example. What part of this brain is dedicated to the arm? And this is important because there are specific parts of the brain dedicated to certain functions. And when it comes to motor movement, especially for the somatic motor movement, so movement of muscles of the body, so skeletal muscles, there's actually specific areas of this primary motor cortex dedicated to certain parts of the body. Now this map, like a topographical map of the body placed on the brain, is called the Motor Homunculus. Now homunculus means little man. So what I can draw is, if I take this, let's pretend that this is the motor cortex. So this is this strip here. This is the motor cortex. I'm going to draw up the way that the body is mapped on the brain for motor movement. Okay? So the first thing you need to see is that here, let's draw it in a different color. Here is where the foot is. Now, I'm not a very good drawer, we all know that. That's where the foot is, and then that means we've got the legs coming up here, and that means we've got the buttocks here, and then the back coming across here. Then we go to the hand, the arm, and the hands. There's going to be thumb, 1, 3, 4, 5. And then after the hand, we're going to have the neck, and then we're going to have the face, and the face is going to be quite large. Again, I'm not a very good drawer. Chin, mouth, tongue is going to be quite large. Nose, eyes. After that, we're going to have the trachea and windpipe moving down. Okay. This is the somatosensory map. So this is the motor homunculus. So that means that when we look in, this part of the motor cortex controls movement of the foot, movement of the leg, abdomen, arm, hands, head, and then throat. So voice box, production of speech. What you can find is that it's not necessarily the fact that the larger the body part, the more area of the brain that's dedicated to it. In actual fact, it's parts of the body that have fine motor movement, so parts of the body that require fine motor movement such as the fingers and the tongue, they have larger areas of the brain dedicated to them. So you can see that the hand is quite large, the tongue is quite large as well. And so this is the motor cortex, which is located in the frontal lobe. Now, what other functions are isolated to the frontal lobe? Well, we know from previous videos that speech production and the ability to speak a language is located predominantly in the left hemisphere of the frontal lobe. And this is known as Broca's area, and you'll find it's located around about here. So this is Broca's area. And I've told you in a previous video that lesions or damage to this area and surrounding areas can lead to something called Broca's aphasia, which is an inability to be able to produce speech or produce language. What you'll find is just anterior to the premotor cortex, remember primary motor cortex, then premotor cortex, just anterior to that is an area of the brain for certain types of eye movement. It's called the frontal eye region, or frontal eye area. It's located around about here. And it allows for rapid eye movement, for example. Okay, what other parts of the frontal lobe are important functionally? Well, pretty much the rest of the frontal lobe, let's just highlight that, pretty much the rest of the frontal lobe, this is an oversimplification, is known as the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is important when it comes to behaviour, understanding what to do in the particular context. Basically what it has to do with, if you need to succeed in school or university or work or within social contexts, it's because of the frontal lobe. It tells you how to behave in a particular way. It allows you to plan and think, critical understanding, executive function. It makes you or allows you to make the right decision in accordance with the social context. How do you know not to just walk up to somebody and not to slap them in the face, just a stranger? How do you know not to say a particular thing to somebody in a particular context? It's because this prefrontal cortex tells us what is right within a particular context. This is important because if people have damage to the premotor cortex, and this has happened, a prime example of this was back in the 1800s, a railway worker called Phineas Gage was creating a railway track, blew up a particular area, and a railway spike went up into his jaw and out of his eye, but pierced his frontal cortex, and it changed his behaviour. He was known as being a very kind, gentle, socially constrained individual prior to the accident, and after the accident was rude, basically was described as having no filter when you had a conversation with them. This is also the area that they used to perform lobotomies on in the 40s and 50s, actually hundreds of lobotomies a year in the States, where they get an ice pick through the eye, through the orbital cavity, chip into the frontal lobe and take a little piece out, and this would change the behaviour of the individual that they performed the frontal lobe lobotomy on. Lobotomy meaning cut out a part of the lobe. So just to highlight the frontal lobe is important for motor movement. It's important for speech production, it's important for executive functioning and knowing what to do in the right social context, and it's important with rapid eye movement as well. Now this is just a couple of examples, but this is an overall quick picture of the frontal lobe.